To introduce here is Stephen Dauphin. I want to, and I get that Dauphin or Dauphin? Sorry, Steve Dauphin. Steve has over 20 years of venture capital experience working in underserved capital markets. Today, he is focused on making venture and growth stage investments with an emphasis on agriculture and energy. Also, through the Kirchner Impact Foundation, Steve and his team are experimenting with new millennial-powered, low-cost, high-impact potential investment models that can cost-effectively push modest amounts of equity investment capital and business resources out to historically unservable regions. Prior to his career in finance, Steve was a DEA special agent, graduated from Harvard with a BA in economics and religion, and received an MBA from UNC Chapel Hill. Please welcome Steve.
Thank you. I'm going to have to stand up. I can't sit down and talk. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm Steve Dauphin, a director with the Kirchner Impact Foundation, and again, also a venture capitalist for a long time in this part of the world, but focused primarily on underserved capital markets. The Kirchner Impact Foundation has a core belief that for-profit businesses that have great DNA, that are built differently, that have a great appreciation for the environment, that treat their employees well, that treat their customers well, are one of the most powerful forces of positive change on the planet. And one of the great things about startups is you can determine that you can get the company built right at the outset, rather than trying to turn a super tanker, which might be a larger company. And so our emphasis is really on how do we use for-profit business as a powerful force of positive change. These are some of the companies we worked with. On the large end of the spectrum would be Juno Therapeutics. We worked on a $176 million Series A round, which at the time was the largest Series A round in the country. On the other extreme would be Lucky Iron Fish, where we led an early seed stage investment to get folks to put a little iron fish in their pot when they're boiling their rice or their noodles, so they can get iron in their diet and defeat iron deficiency. That actually came out of Guelph University in Canada, some great technology there. So we've worked across the spectrum, and it's from this perspective, from this capital markets perspective, that we are thrilled to be here. I actually think the notion of university cities, of these groups getting together to exchange best practices and innovate, is absolutely brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant, and actually I shared the website of University Cities just a few weeks ago with a group focused on rural areas, and they said, wow, there's an interesting model there that we might also be able to replicate. So I really commend those of you who have organized it and those who have funded it. Is really fantastic. But the ecosystem really is the right image, I think, to think about entrepreneurial activity. Not top-down, not like a Marshall Plan. It's more like a farm management plan. And you have to have a lot of things happen at one time, and there's been a lot of good conversation today about how do you have passionate talent, how do you attract that talent. You have to have a robust opportunity pipeline. You mentioned it sounds like some great numbers coming out of the university. That's just critical. And to continuing to foster that, because many, in fact, most of them won't make it. So you have to have a robust pipeline that reloads constantly. You have to have a complete capital continuum. That means that you have to have money at every stage. You have to have the R&D money, which is a huge advantage for university cities. You have to have seed stage capital. You have to have growth stage capital. And that is one of the disadvantages sometimes in university cities, is you may not have the back end of the capital continuum, and I'll touch on that again in a minute. And then, of course, is this leadership to put a lasso around all of that and give a sense of vision and purpose that everyone can attempt to achieve. There are some advantages to small. So disadvantage, you don't have big buckets of money like San Francisco and New York and Boston. But there are a lot of advantages to small. And I really think the best example to study, I think, is what's happened in Israel. Many of you have probably read the book Startup Nation. It's a fantastic book. And Israel had a very limited set of resources available to it, but it also had some fantastic strengths. And it also was small. And what's important about small, you can know everything that's going on. Hypothetically, you can know every single company that's in your community that's in need of capital. You can know every single technology that's promising within the university. You can know every single business player who could help those companies along. That's something you simply can't do in a Philadelphia or a New York or a Boston or even a Miami. But it's doable in a town of this size. And so you have some inherent advantages of small, particularly with university cities. So here's what we focus on from a capital markets perspective. When we look at a place where we want to be active and where we want to operate, we need to see a complete opportunity set. Ideally, you want to see a complete opportunity set. You want to have a place where there's R&D going on, and you can see how the graph has that higher. It should be higher in university cities. But you also want to have and know what are your companies that might be in need of capital along the way, in need of growth. On the other side, you need the capital to fund those companies at those stages. Again, there should be an inherent advantage to a university city that the R&D should be disproportionately large. I mean, you have a starting advantage that most other places don't have. The disadvantage is on the end with the checkered boxes. You probably don't have 3 or 4 venture capital funds in Lexington, Kentucky. You probably don't have 3 or 4 growth equity funds in Lexington, Kentucky, and that's something for which you want to solve. But these are requisite elements of real success, would be sufficient deal flow and sufficient capital. So I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. These are just anecdotes of things that I think are interesting. So if you think about, again, this problem on the end, how can you solve for this venture capital problem? Well, there are a lot of ways to attack it, but the one where I would start would be that map. Those are the non-stop flights from Lexington, Kentucky. Those venture capital markets, who are the venture capital firms in those markets? Who are the growth equity firms in those markets? If it's in St. Louis, they might be able to drive, but if they're in New Orleans, they're not coming because they have to change planes in Atlanta or Charlotte, and they're not coming. It needs to be, they need to be able to think of this company as a place they can make a reasonable day trip. Can I get there and back and work with my company? And I think that's also a part of keeping them here after you grow a great business. These are the kinds of things that you have to think about. If you've grown a great business that ultimately has to move, that really doesn't accomplish the goal that you're after. Another example would be a fellowship that we have worked on for 5 years, which is really trying to focus on the least served capital markets, which is a fellowship program which actually bridges the divide between the community and the academic institution, where we take incredibly talented young students, we give them access to discretionary capital, we use a highly innovative training program that within a matter of months, they are making an investment decision on their own. Now, we've done this from a national perspective. We're doing it now in Mexico. We may launch a program in Israel next year, but we're also looking at a university-based model where you might envision a system, a university system, that would identify a handful of students through an incredibly competitive process, invest some of the foundation capital in a handful of promising companies that fit a mandate that's consistent with the vision that Lexington, for example, might be trying to promote. And it makes it real. It crosses the bridge and it makes it real. And because it's real, the rate of learning is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. It gets it out of the classroom and it makes it real. Another example, and this gets over my head pretty quickly, and I don't work on this project, but another interesting thing that some of the folks that I know and work with at Kirchner in the Kirchner Academic Enterprise area are working on an SBIR holdco. So how do you maximize your SBIR dollars by bringing CEO talent down in a new and innovative way? So those are a few examples, but my big take, again from our perspective, would be that the first thing you have to do when you think about how do we maximize this entrepreneurial ecosystem would be, let's assess the positive deviations. What has happened really well here? How did it happen? You know, who are the great companies that have already come up out of the system? And let's study what they did and learn from that. Secondly, do a complete inventory of all of the assets. And you mentioned some of them already coming out of the university, but extend that to the community. Does the city know every company that is a promising company? And here's the idea. If we call Startup Nation in Israel today, and again, I do a lot of work in agriculture. If we call them today and say, look, here's what I'm interested in. I'm worried about post-harvest loss. Do you have companies focused on post-harvest loss? They'll know. And not only will they say, here are the 5 companies you want to talk to, they're going to say, here's the 17 research projects underway at Hebrew University or other universities that might be of interest down the road. That is incredibly powerful, and it's not expensive. It's just information and knowledge, but it's packaging it up and making it accessible. So I think that inventory is important. And then evolving the ecosystem. And again, I think that's what so much of the conversation here is about, is what's special about this university place? How do we pick the areas where we're the strongest and design a custom ecosystem? And then lastly, the last two would be communicating the vision and executing. And communicating the vision is probably the hardest and most important thing, because we're dealing with some extraordinary egos here. We're dealing with professors and venture capitalists and CEOs, and getting that vision set and getting a little bit of humility injected into the system is critical. But I think the leadership piece is the hardest challenge, but to set a single vision, rather than telling everyone what to do, telling everyone where you want to go and let them get to it. So those are my initial thoughts, and look forward to some questions. But thank you.
Thanks, Steve.